Today, on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Richard S. Levy joins me in examining anti-Semitism. We look at its origins in the 19th century and talk a little bit about how it impacts politics today and also how it's being broadcast on the internet. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Richard S. Levy. Dr. Levy is here to talk with us about anti-Semitism. He has a Ph.D. from Yale University. He teaches at University of Illinois in Chicago in the area of German history and the Holocaust. Thank you for joining us.
Very glad to be here. Thank you.
Dr. Levy, I understand you have a somewhat of a different definition of anti-Semitism. You want to start with that, please?
First, I think it's important to define it. I think most people just use the term kind of flagrantly. Well, if you ask them what it means, they'll say, I know it when I see it, I know it when I hear it. But I think this is too general and too broad to be useful, especially if one of your concerns is to fight anti-Semitism. It's important to know, to focus on what you can fight and what makes sense to fight. So when I was working on my history of some small anti-Semitic political parties in Germany before World War I asked the question of how are these people different from people who didn't like Jews in previous centuries. Right. And one of the obvious differences was these were individuals who were intent on acting against Jews, not primarily thinking about them or saying bad things, but to disempower Jews.
So one of the early distinctions we're making here then is it's not just an attitude about Jews or a dislike of Jews. It's actually involves planning to disempower them or do something about it.
It's a difference between thought and action.
Right.
People can go throughout their lives with anti-Jewish prejudices and never do anything about it. It needs to be organized. I don't want to discount the importance of anti-Jewish prejudice because it's there's always a great pool of possible recruits, foot soldiers for individuals who want to mobilize that sentiment for a specific end, either specifically against Jews or for some other cause, to fight globalization, for example.
Right.
And that narrows the field a bit. I think it's prejudice by itself is not going to lead to the Holocaust. It has to be channeled, and that's basically the attempts to do that are what I've studied for many years.
The term is first used.
You're right.
Mid
I have not found
a
use of it before 1860, and it was then used as a kind of a cultural critique. It used politically 1879. It's pretty easy to date it specifically. And it was meant to be distinguished from traditional religiously based anti-Jewish feeling and action. Had a scientific ring to it. And it was a kind of a branding war was being fought, and it catches on with incredible speed, which I take to mean that there was a kind of a perceived need for a new word. That what preceded in the preceding centuries, even though there were acts of violence against Jews, sometimes prolonged acts of pogroms, this was a new situation, and the situation was that Jews were perceived to be, by the end of the 19th century, enormously powerful. I think this is a misperception, but when you compare the starting point, late 1700s, when they were basically peddlers and paupers, with a few very rich people at the top, they now entered the arts, politics, and certainly economic life, and were very visible, as they never had been before. So they seem menacing instead of just irritating or non-believers or unbelievers. Now they might use the power that they had amassed quietly, sneakily. Okay, this is part of the Jewish stereotype.
So some of these arguments that we might associate with Germany, World War II, Nazi propaganda actually go back 100 years or at least
yeah, at least 50 years.
Yeah, 50 years.
And the small anti-Semitic parties that pop up all over Europe at the end of the 19th century attempt to solve the so-called Jewish problem.
Did this start somewhere? Was there one voice for this at one point?
Well, Germany is the starting point.
It is,
but it spreads very quickly, and the word itself spreads with an incredible speed. All the major languages in Europe, you find it in titles of books, the mastheads of newspapers within the space of 20 years.
Were there more Jews in Germany than in France or England? Or?
Yes, many more than in France or England,
but
not nearly as many as in Poland and Russia. Germany led the way in the politicalization of anti-Jewish feeling, and its example was followed elsewhere. But all of these attempts to solve the Jewish question through legislative action, conventional ways, were dismal failures. They could not interest enough of their fellow countrymen to get the sizable representation in parliaments, which would have enabled them to change the laws, disenfranchise the Jews, basically keep them from using their power, disempower them. It was a miscalculation on their part, and by 1914, exception of Austria, every anti-Semitic party was on the point of disappearing, and then comes the war.
So there were actually anti-Semitic parties then. It was that organized.
Yeah, not very impressive. They start sort of impressively, but they're not very good legislators. They attract a lot of cranks, and they're not very hard-working. They're agitators.
Sort of similar to what the Ku Klux Klan represented in the U.S.?
Much less violent.
Yeah.
And when I say conventional, I mean they thought that they were doing something responsible and respectable. They produced, of course, outlier radicals, but they basically pushed those guys to the periphery, obeyed the law, we're going to use the constitutional means, and live happily ever after. But they couldn't get enough votes. And I think that's important to remember. There are a lot of people who don't like Jews very much in Germany, but they could not be recruited for a political movement. It wasn't important enough to them. It was not on their top priority. And anti-Semites were not very successful in creating more anti-Semites. They could get votes, and that was a matter of how bad things were economically or socially. Then they could do fairly well, but they were doomed.
And there was something similar going on in Russia too, right?
But not politically organized. This was a much more traditional kind of Jew hatred, the pogroms.
So explain the pogroms and how that came about.
They're fairly spontaneous. For many years it was thought they were secretly organized by the Tsar, but the Tsar was very leery about fomenting violence against anybody because it could spill over too easily on Tsarism itself. The usual motives, religious deviance, economic exploitation. Jews were tavern owners and money lenders, and most of the population were rural people, farmers. Lots of resentment against that. And it would explode occasionally, and once it's started to get going, 1881, 1882, again in the early years of the early 1900s, they could be deadly.
So what would happen? This would be a small community, so people would get together and decide they're going to...
There was a lot of greed involved. There was no political program. There was no, let's disenfranchise the Jews, because the Jews were not enfranchised. They had no rights. Basically, they were forced to live in what was called a Pale of Settlement. It was, they were an easy target in some respects. They were a surrogate.
They would be driven out of town, their property would be confiscated, things like that.
Their property would be stolen, sometimes they would be killed, and then order would be restored. And it would spread from town to town, and there were the waves.
So there was really
an economic, went back to normal.
Yeah, there's an economic
certainly economic
motivation to this as well. That's interesting.
Were certainly a factor, but it had no program, no solution to the Jewish question. That was what was developed in Germany and then emulated in Austria, Hungary, France, to no avail. So I mean, if you want to think about what these movements had to do with Hitler, I think. I think the answer to that question is it was how not to do it. You can't solve this problem in Parliament because there are liberals in Parliament, socialists, Catholics who are not going to support this disenfranchisement of the Jews.
Sure.
So the conventional anti-Semites become more radical. They say, well, we thought all we had to do was push the Jews out of German life and everybody would be okay.
Yeah.
But now we're going to have to change everything: journalism, education, the economy, maybe even the way we're ruled. They became revolutionary.
So then they decide they're going to purge all of these institutions.
Right, they have to be revolutionized. Then we can solve the Jewish question, which is what Hitler did. Hitler did not, even though the Nazis were represented in the Reichstag during the Weimar Republic, they made no serious effort to solve the Jewish question. First we get power, and then we can dispense with Parliament and the dissenting voices in Parliament. I mean, Hitler gets rid of Parliament altogether. Essentially, it's a rubber stamp. It's a one-party state. And I think that's important, and that's why it's important to distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish prejudice. It takes more to organize action against Jews, more persuasion, more intimidation than was available in a democratic state or a reasonably liberal state, states with parliaments. You couldn't control the media. Well, when Hitler gets to power, that's one of the first things he does. He controls the press. He gets rid of the parliament, and then he can.
It seems like one of the elements of this was kind of trying to generate a mass hysteria or paranoia, I guess. What about the sort of the paranoia aspect of it?
Yeah, I think that's crucial, and I think it's the conspiratorial thinking.
Yeah,
and I think it's very clearly on the rise in the 20th century. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, notorious literary
and that is
hoax.
that's a book that was published in Russia late 1900s.
That spreads all over the world.
Can we talk about that for a minute?
Sure. Nobody knows who actually wrote it.
Right.
And
it's attributed to Jewish authors, right?
Right.
And supposedly it's their game plan for undermining Russian cultures.
It purports to be a master plan for the enslavement of the non-Jewish world.
Yeah.
And it's often dated as the first Zionist Congress in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland, where a secret meeting, the chief rabbi, who becomes later Theodor Herzl, laid out the plan. But it was written by a bunch of Russians, and it had probably fairly innocuous purpose. It wanted to influence personnel decisions of the Tsar, wanted to put some spine in the Tsar. This is what the Jews would do if they had power. This is what you should do to your enemies. But then it gets to be much bigger.
It's kind of like, it seems to me it's kind of parallel to Machiavelli's The Prince, right? It's as if they manufactured a version of The Prince.
It's funny you should say that. It's a plagiarism of a satirical play from the 1860s in France, in which Machiavelli is talking to Montesquieu. Montesquieu is sort of a forerunner of liberal enlightened thought. Machiavelli is Machiavelli. Yeah. And all of the speeches of Machiavelli are put in the mouth of the chief rabbi.
Well, you know, another interesting parallel there is neither one of them was ever actually implemented or used for anything.
Had nothing to do with Jews.
Yeah, and Machiavelli apparently was not all that influential.
But I mean, the power of this document is that it answered all the questions, and people had lots of questions, but particularly by the end of World War I, where it gets outside of Russia, where it was never that important, but spreads to the rest of Europe, and people have a lot of questions to answer. You know, how did the invincible German army get defeated? What happened to the Kaisers? Why are women behaving outrageously in public? Who's responsible for this? And this little scenario comes along and says it's the Jews, and this is how they do it, and this is how carefully they planned it.
So you can almost just look at your culture and list all of the things that are going on, the changes that are happening that seem to be devaluing tradition and stuff like that. Or attribute it to a source, and you've got a version of the elders.
Or things that you would like to change or bring back. The original protocols longs for the return of the aristocracy and the power of the aristocracy. Your only true friends. And, but this is a strain of organized anti-Semitism that continues right to the present moment.
Well, it seems that we get arguments like this, very parallel to this, about the media, and people feeling that their lives have changed because and they attribute willpower to the media, as if you could lump, public radio in with, with Rush Limbaugh and.
Yes. Well, the way the conventional anti-Semites explained their failure was they could not wrest control of the media away from the Jews.
So the attack on the media, to some extent, for some people, may be an attack on
right. It's a way of saying
Jewish culture.
My countrymen are so stupid that they can be easily manipulated by whoever controls the media, television or the newspapers. Nobody reads newspapers anymore, but. And that's why we have to get control of them, because otherwise we'll never win their hearts.
Well, and politically, recently we've been getting arguments about liberals. The first time I really noticed this was, I think, Bush Sr. was calling Dukakis a card-carrying liberal. And they said he's a member of the American Civil Liberties Union. That used to be something you could use on your resume.
It goes back further, I think.
Well, I'm sure it does.
Agnew and Nixon.
Right.
Knittering nabobs of negativism.
Right. The attack on the media. Right?
Yes. Well, originally the liberals were blamed for two related things: the emancipation of the Jews, that is, making Jews equal citizens, first in France, then Germany, and almost everywhere by 1918, everywhere in Europe. That was liberal dupes or liberal sellouts did this for the Jews, and the other was the economic system that would, boom bust, and when it went bust, they were blamed for the free market economy, Manchesterism it was called. And yes, they're the villains, and thought to be liberalism either a Jewish invention or suborned. Another interesting ally, Freemasons. These people who have
secret society. Right?
Actually, that's it. That's the importance, the secrecy of it. So anyway, conspiratorial thinking is easy. You accept the basic premise. Okay, the Jews are engaged in a world conspiracy and have been for a long time. That's what you should be proving. Okay, you accept that as given. Then you can come up with all kinds of connections. Well, the Rothschilds, the crash of 1873 was a serious economic setback for all over Europe. Started with the failure of a Rothschild bank in Vienna. You think that was an accident? There are no accidents.
Well, that's one of the great arguments for why people should go to college, so they'd be exposed to a lot of different things and not be able to kind of create their own little mystery.
I want to believe that
world,
but there have been some very intelligent anti-Semites. It's often described as a losers movement. But
who are other than the
Richard Wagner, was probably the most famous composer of the late 19th century. Henry Ford, the self-made man, was financing distribution of the protocols of the elders.
Oh, really? Wow.
In a 4-volume book entitled "The International Jew: The World's Foremost Problem." He lost money on it. And lots of others. General Ludendorff in Germany was a big, important general in World War I. It attracts not only people who want to use this raw material. You can't tell whether they're sincere in what they utter or whether they're trying to stir up the troops. But they usually have ulterior motives as well as solving the Jewish problem. I think even today it's hard to tell. And it's immaterial anyway, whether they believe what they're saying or not, because in the age of the internet, Well, can we talk about the internet?
Well, sure, go ahead. I mean, you know, I know there have been a lot of movies that have dealt with themes like this, but how's the internet contributing to the situation?
To me, what's different about anti-Semitism today is the political parties have disappeared. Organizations with pronounced anti-Semitic views present no programs, no agendas. Stop immigration, don't let Jews be school teachers forever. None of that.
Yeah.
They live in this virtual reality. We don't know how large their organizations are. They have no terrestrial headquarters, and they have no costs of operation, nil. All they need is a computer. But they're doing basically the same sort of thing. That is, they pick their cause and associate it with Jews, which is possible to do. Jews are involved in all kinds of things.
Sure.
I don't think they control much of anything, but you don't point that out to the person you want to subscribe to your views. Makes it a bad thing. I mean, it goes back to the 19th century. Liberalism, literary modernism, communism, socialism, capitalism.
So as we're getting towards the end of the discussion here, why don't we look a little bit at liberalism? It's in some people's minds, attacking liberalism, intellectualism, the media is kind of is also attacking Jews. There's a connection there for some people.
Yeah, it's more commonly in America, I think, called the elites. And that
goes back to the Agnew-Nixon era, right?
And it's it's a very deep-seated anger, I think.
Yeah,
and
the Beltway.
This is a movement that lives off of anger. But what I'm concerned about is, even though you have this internet tool and reach an audience, an immensely large audience, effortlessly. On the other hand, before I panic about this, it's also true that it allows you to be tracked as well. And there are certainly organizations tracking these radical rightist groups. It used to be that you would hold an anti-Semitic meeting, educational meeting, agitation meeting, and at this meeting you would hand out copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and try to influence the people trying to make up their mind about whether they want to join this movement. Now you can't do that. You go to the internet, and I did this recently. I did a Google search of Protocols of Elders of Zion, got 640,000 hits. I didn't read all of them, but the first 3 pages I looked at, 3 of the sites, obviously true believers. This explains everything. This is why we have to beware of the Jews. And the other 7 were debunking. This is the false nature of it. So you can't
it's actually a better forum because it allows for.
Well, you can't be. You can't get your message out, your hate message out, without being contested. Okay, and I think that's sort of encouraging. I mean, not for the people who are already have made up their minds, but for the fence sitters and the people who are curious.
Well, so on the one hand, something can be very persuasive on the internet. I recently was convinced that Paul McCartney was dead by watching a documentary. My friend straightened me out.
He's not looking well, but
no, he's not.
A little story. Do we have time for a
sure,
little
go
story?
ahead.
Late 80s, I was taking my car into the mechanic.
Yeah.
I don't know what was wrong with it, but he said, we're going to have to keep it overnight for observation. I had to take a cab home. I get in this cab, and it's filled with little doodads and ornaments, a lot of indications that from the Vietnam War. And the cab driver is a big, heavy-set guy. And before I even sat down, he said, you want to hear about how we're becoming a police state? Of course, I said yes. This is what I do for a living. But I asked him, the only question I asked for the entire ride home that gave him any pause was, are we coming from the left or the right? And of course, I knew the answer, but he said, neither. This is the truth. And he laid out very articulately with bibliography and footnotes. But I said, no, if this is true what you're saying, how can you stand to live in this world if it's going to be so horrible? And he paused for a moment and he said, there'll come a time to act. And when that time comes, I will act out of knowledge. And I, obviously, buffoon that I am, I will be swept away. And I think the moral of the story is that no matter how arcane, how irrational the conspiracy is, it empowers the person who believes in it. He has this esoteric knowledge that we don't. And it gave him an identity. This is a guy who didn't have much else going for him. And you cling to something like that, and facts are powerless against it.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have on our program today. I want to thank Dr. Richard S. Levy for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.